The Awakening of Joel Singer by Scott McCaffrey. Narrated by Luke Welland. Please like and subscribe. Part 1. Joel Awakens. I'm a long way from Vermont, Neil thought to himself as he stood before the grizzly. He had been admonished when he told the locals in Fairbanks that solo camping in his old Green Mountain State home had prepared him to go north of the Arctic Circle, here in Alaska. It was looking like he wouldn't have the chance to tell those folks they were right. The bear must have been 10 feet long, and he could have sworn it was as big as an elephant, though elephants don't foam at the mouth the way this bear was doing. What was that other tidbit he had heard? A bear can run a lot faster than you, but only for short distances, or was that a rhino? He had to run either way, to the first tree he saw with branches low enough to grab. That's why it was too bad he didn't at first see the cub in front of the first otherwise accommodating tree. He wasn't confused about this piece of advice. The worst place you could be was between a bear and her cub. He ran to the left, away from the cub and its mother, hoping this would satisfy the bear. It didn't. The growling grew louder behind him, the increase in sound being the only way he was tracking the bear, because he didn't want to see his own death. Then the growl suddenly turned into a whimper. Neil looked over and saw the most amazing sight. A lithe little boy of about 10 calmly held the bear over his head with one hand. He then threw the bear no less than 20 yards, its legs flailing for control. It landed and went rolling away harmlessly as decayed leaves expelled outward. Neil wasn't sure if anything could scare him more than a grizzly, but he never thought it would be a 10-year-old boy. The boy looked over at him and smiled, the last thing Neil remembered before he fainted. When Neil woke up, he was being loaded into an ambulance at the edge of the woods. The boy was there too, being spoken to by the park ranger, but he wasn't talking back. He was wearing animal skins that seemed designed strictly for coverage against the elements. He was muscular, but not freakishly so, if muscular is a word one would really use to describe a 10-year-old, with scraggly brown hair and brown eyes. It was hard to tell what ethnicity he was, or even what race. Finally, the ranger motioned to the ambulance, and the boy joined Neil there after refusing a stretcher. The boy said nothing as they pulled away, but then neither did Neil at first, as stunned as he still was. Finally, Neil said, "Thank you." The boy sat silently but seemed to sense that Neil had said something positive, as he did smile back. They were pulling into Fort Yukon, Alaska, the largest town for hundreds of miles, although it more resembled the first part of its appellation. Rectangular warehouse-style buildings of corrugated metal occupied most of the only significant commercial street, though most of them were being used as warehouses. They were interspersed with a handful of rectangular wooden cabins, similarly varied in purpose. Neil wasn't really sure he needed to be taken in an ambulance to the health center since, aside from his shock, he only had a few cuts and bruises. "How did you do that?" He finally got the courage to ask the boy. Again, no response. Neil gave up. The boy seemed more interested in a 4-inch cut on Neil's shin than his words. He touched it, and a second later it was healed. The boy didn't seem shocked at all by what he had done, but he looked puzzled at how Neil's mouth now hung agape. Neil soon found himself at a more modern building than most in town, although it looked more like a big doctor's office than a hospital. They didn't believe a word of his story as Neil expected, but it was fun to tell anyway. The boy wordlessly refused treatment when they arrived at the Bare Bones Medical Center and started wandering the halls. Neil was given no such option and was soon brought to a treatment room. That's when he heard yelling from the other room, and the doctor and one of the nurses ran out. He overheard a man explaining in loud shouts that he had just been able to get out of his wheelchair. "This little kid came in, smiled at me, and then touched my leg. The next thing I know, I get this warm feeling coming up my legs. Don't ask me why I even tried, because my legs have been useless since Korea. But God bless this kid. I stood up. My God, I stood up. I went to hug the kid and he got scared and took off." The man went on to describe a wiry boy of about 10 or so. The boy and the creature that had been attacked by the bear were put in some kind of nest that moved, with rounded legs at the bottom. The boy couldn't tell if the nest was alive. He couldn't hear or feel its heartbeat, although he could sense little explosions going on inside, and it gave off a lot of heat. This animal he had saved from the bear seemed to be trying to tell him something, but the noise was much more varied than what he was used to from other animals, more complicated than just a warning or an expression of fear. In any case, this new animal made a face while he made noises that seemed to express that he meant no harm. He had a cut on his leg, which the boy healed like he did for other animals he came across. The animal then had a look on his face that seemed to express fear along with shock. The boy was surprised that this animal like him would seem so surprised. After all, he could do the same thing, couldn't he? Then the moving nest stopped. The other animals like him led the boy and the hurt animal outside. The boy looked up and noticed he was in front of a much bigger nest. This one was many times larger than any nest he had ever seen before, and shaped very neatly, nothing like the dams the beavers put together. Many animals came out of the large nest and rolled the hurt animal into it very hurriedly. He walked into the nest with them. Other animals like him led into a small space and gave him new coverings to put on. They were much softer and lighter than the skins he was wearing, but not as warm. More animals, these in long white coverings, came in and began making complicated noises at him. The boy picked up a different pattern of noises. They seemed to expect him to respond, but he didn't. Eventually they walked away looking confused. The boy was curious about this nest, so he left the small space and walked into some of the other rooms. Almost everyone in the room seemed to be sick or hurt. He was surprised no one had fixed them yet. He went into one room where someone had cuts all over his face, and his arm hanging in a tool made of white stone. This animal with the broken arm again made complex noises to him. He walked over and touched him on the arm, healing him. The animal also looked shocked and started moving the arm in the tool made of stone. He started making frantic noises at him. One pattern of noises repeated itself over and over, as if the animal was trying to get a particular response from him. The creature grabbed him, not necessarily aggressively, but the boy still didn't like it. He walked away. The animal followed him out and went into the next room and began communicating with an animal there in the same excited manner. The boy entered another room, where a very old animal sat in a tool that also had round things it could roll on. The animal's legs looked small and weak, so he thought maybe he needed the tool to move because he couldn't walk. He walked over to the animal and put a hand on his legs. The animal's response was startled like the others, but much more so this time. The animal leaped out of his rolling tool and tried to grab him. The boy broke the grip easily and left. He walked into one more room where an animal lay looking gaunt, his breathing labored. The boy did not see any visible injuries, but nevertheless placed a hand on the animal to heal him. Nothing happened. He tried again, to no avail. Frustrated and perplexed, he looked out on a crowd that had gathered outside. He decided to leave. These funny animals were not going to make that easy. As he tried to leave, they came pouring out of their rooms, some limping, some coughing terribly, some being wheeled or even carried out by other animals. There were over 20 of them now, out in the passageway, 10 of whom were blocking his path. He began to panic as the animals grabbed him until he sensed how weak these animals were, even the two biggest ones in neat white coverings that reached for him, who were more than twice his own size. Instead, the boy broke their grips on him easily, then grabbed these two biggest animals that reached for him, picked them up one in each hand, and putting them down on his sides so he could keep moving forward. The rest of the group cleared out, as they too got shocked looks on their faces, although this time not mixed with happiness. This scared him, and now he really wanted to get out of this nest. He leapt over the other animals in a tight roll, then again down the rest of the hallway in one bound. He opened the door and slipped outside. 2 seconds later, he was running through a stone field filled with more nests with the round things under them, never looking back. The cancer patient, the boy had failed to heal, walked slowly out to the hallway using his cane. He followed the others out the door to see where the boy had gotten to. But he was gone. The man didn't notice a small squirrel running across the parking lot. Robert looked up at the clock, 3 a.m. The solitary light of the lamp on his mahogany desk reflected dully on the corner office walls covered with degrees earned and honorary plaques and awards. The buzz of Manhattan below produced a white noise that only focused his energies further, as he held the anomaly of a microscope that punctuated his desk. He went back to work on the finishing touches of No-Tech's latest development, Vanquimax, a drug consisting of a set of semi-synthetic white blood cells that worked far better than the body's natural white blood cells, and couldn't be destroyed or corrupted by cancer, HIV, or other diseases. These cells were actually nano-robots, powered by the body's natural electricity. Because they weren't really alive, they couldn't be killed or become cancerous. They were, however, made from advanced carbon polymers that mimicked real white blood cells so well that they were not rejected by the body. The brilliance of the artificial cells was that they did not depend on chemical reactions for efficacy, to which some pathogens would inevitably adapt. Instead, the cells wrapped around pathogens and superheated them to 6,000 degrees, a temperature at which life was impossible. On the outside of the cells was a ceramic shell, not dissimilar from the tiles used on the space shuttle, but in amorphous solid form, which could take this incredible heat. It would be the greatest invention of the past 50 years. But not the next 50, not even close. Tina walked past the usual crew of homeless men that could be found near the dilapidated brick apartment building she shared with her mother in the South Bronx. They usually appeared to be psychotic, albeit harmless. Nevertheless, she gave them a wide berth, especially this new one she saw now leaning against a rickety black lamppost. She didn't need to end up like that girl that had gotten pushed onto the subway tracks by a homeless guy a few weeks back. "Get a job, Holmes. This corner's already crowded," Tina heard someone say behind her. She looked back over her shoulder. It had been said to the newcomer. He actually gave a response. "Do you know where I could get one?" "Wise-ass motherfucker," the middle-aged man said back and then moved on. What seemed funny to Tina was that the homeless man's question didn't seem to have been asked ironically, despite how the passerby had reacted. He also didn't speak in an addled fashion. She now noticed that the vagrant seemed young for a homeless guy, only about 20. He was thin and looked like he was biracial, or maybe a light-skinned African-American. If his speech clashed with his station, his dress didn't, consisting of a torn army jacket and dingy khakis. Tina started to walk back toward the young man, but then she remembered the other homeless man she had spoken with a few years back who had spoken coherently and apparently sanely, right until he had introduced himself as President Bill Clinton. She turned back around and headed toward home, pulling her coat more tightly around herself as a cold breeze kicked up in the already frigid night. Conan O'Brien actually had some good guests on, so Tina had stayed up a little later than usual. She was just crossing the worn linoleum floor of the galley kitchen in the small 2-bedroom apartment when she heard an odd sound from outside the door. She crept closer to the entrance and looked through the keyhole but saw nothing. She knew her mom would be furious if she woke up and saw her now, but curiosity had gotten the better of her. She opened the door a crack to see where the strange animal noise was coming from. It was the young homeless man from the nearby corner. He was making the strange sound to a stray cat that looked even more careworn than him. He was trying to get the wary cat to take the half-eaten piece of chicken he was offering. The call was something like a cat, but more like something from a larger wildcat she couldn't specify. A few seconds later, the cat did come over and nibble at the offering. Tina remembered well enough what her mom had said about what to do about any homeless men that she spotted encroaching on their hallways. Don't say a word to them. Just call the cops. She nevertheless found herself approaching the man in her pajamas. Do you need any more food? She asked him. The man was on the ground and had his back turned. He seemed startled by the question. He turned around slowly and faced Tina diffidently. No, I'm okay, he said. I'm sorry for coming inside here. I know it's not allowed. It was just so cold. I heard you out there before, she said. Did you mean what you said about wanting a job? Yes, I guess. I work at a local Italian restaurant called Carlino's. I might be able to get you a busboy job there if you'd like. Sure, he responded. That'd be great. How did you do that? She asked. Do what? Make that wildcat sound. Oh, I went camping a lot as a kid and picked up a couple of tricks. He took a good look now at this rare person who had taken an interest in him. She was a Latina girl. She stood about 5 feet 7 inches tall with a nice figure. She wore pajamas, but still also big gold hoop earrings. A red scrunchie held her long hair in a ponytail. She had a somewhat large nose and a mildly tough semblance, but she was fairly attractive. I'm Tina. What's your name? She asked. Guess, was the best response he could manage. Tina chuckled. She looked around on his clothing to see if maybe they'd given him a name tag at a shelter. There was nothing. The only thing that caught her eye was a Christmas decoration behind him that said, Noel. Joel? She asked, the decoration prompting the similar word. That's right, he responded, not that she believed him. What's your last name? Singer, he said, as the musical guest played in the background. 3 months later. Joel had filled the last tray and was bringing it to the kitchen. After he was done with it, he would still need to clean out the popcorn machine, wipe down all the trays, take out the garbage, and sweep out the walk-in refrigerators. Then he would return to his studio apartment on Jerome Avenue in the Bronx. He wanted to gather up the laundry he needed to take to the laundromat tomorrow, or he would probably not get to it. He liked to get to the laundromat early, before a crowd arrived. He was rarely spoken to, since he didn't look like he could speak Spanish, the virtually exclusive language in this area, but he still preferred the laundromat when it was empty, so he didn't have to endure the stares of curious neighbors. At the restaurant, the busboy and dishwasher staff mostly ignored him, though they had figured out that he spoke Spanish, or understood it, as was more accurate to say, considering how he rarely spoke. He hoped he wouldn't have to stay in this job much longer now that he had gotten his GED, but it had served its purpose, allowing him to save up enough for the deposit on the publicly subsidized apartment he had moved into the week before. Not that he would have known where to start going about getting those things, nor his social security number and driver's license, without Tina's help. She still checked up on him every 2 or 3 days. My little stray cat, she called him. Joel had gotten the feeling that her mother wasn't too happy about the situation. Don't people usually take stray cats to the pound? Her mother had said once when she had stopped by with Tina. Tina had half-joked that she could call Guinness about how quickly he had gotten his GED after not being able to read. Don't they look out for frauds, though? Her mother had commented. Joel had just finished wiping down all the trays for Juan, the dishwasher, and was taking the garbage outside when he heard, Tu dinero, vendejo. Joel put his head outside in the cold air, but not for long. He pulled his head back in and slammed the door shut when he saw a fist hit Juan's stomach. He had seen Juan start to fall to his knees by the dumpster, but never saw him hit the asphalt. Joel's face began to sweat. The 3 guys outside were all bigger than Juan, and himself. One had Juan by his neck and another by his arms, while the third took advantage of the punching bag. Joel stood there for a little over a minute and cringed as each blow landed. Finally, he wiped the sweat from his face, took a deep breath to fight off the nausea, and called 911. Rick, the restaurant's senior waiter, heard him on the phone and rushed through the kitchen, knocking over the trays Joel had just wiped. The muggers scrambled away as Rick came out, mainly because there were now 5 guys behind Rick, although that's not how he would tell it later. Are you okay, man? Rick asked as sirens came within earshot. Joel didn't have to go outside to know that Juan wasn't. He was happy to hear 10 minutes later that Juan was still alive, but he had an eye sealed shut and his 2 front teeth knocked out. The muggers had gotten Juan's wallet by the time Rick and those behind him got outside. "Hey, Joel," Rick said. "Thanks a lot for helping out Juan. The fucking guy could have been killed, boss. You're standing there with your dick in one hand calling the cops with the other so you can wait half an hour for them to come and get Juan's fucking body?" Joel had no response to this. After he was done with sweeping out the refrigerators, he just slipped away, not even looking Juan in the eye. Joel sat on his bed and pulled off his shoes. His feet were sore. Something was poking him on both his heels, as if pebbles had slipped down to the same spot on each foot. He shook the cheap black sneakers but produced nothing. Vexed, he finally pulled off his right sock to find a light green fibrous nub growing out of his sore heel. He thought it was an odd fungus until he recalled a conversation he had had with Tina the day before in Central Park, joking how the protected century-old London plane tree there had the best rent control of all. The nubs weren't fungus. They were the beginning of roots. Joel hadn't been out of the apartment for a while, and the cupboard was pretty bare. He also had a 50-inch TV he was going to pick up to save delivery on. It was ready at a store a little over a block away, but he wasn't sure he could get it himself and had no one to ask for help. He was surprised at how heavy everything now felt. He feared he had become as weak as, or weaker than his fellow humans. He guessed that's what he was, human, although humans couldn't change color, shape, or size to suit their surroundings. Come to think of it, he didn't think he could either now. Not that he had tried for years. Some people seemed to feel sorry for him because he kept to himself so much. More commonly, people gave him a hard time, wanting to know if he was mute and or deaf. The social pecking order with these humans, in particular the men, was based somewhat on size and fighting ability, but also seemed based largely on wittiness. It seemed to involve comments that were bold, often in a sexual way. The comments often put others down, which is where snide and pushy questions and comments toward him seemed to come into play. This kind of verbal dominance and subjugation seemed to largely replace the physical dominance that was required to mate in the animal world. Being physically superior was still important, although the fighting he saw in the forest was sublimated for the most part by more complicated physical contests called sports. The select few who were excellent at these contests were seen as more attractive by females, while less athletic males often went wanting. He thought that there was a time his formerly great strength and speed would have allowed him to excel at sports, but he wasn't so sure anymore. Even though he was more at home back in the woods in Alaska, he felt that genetically he was a person. He also knew that only in this world would he find out where he had come from, who his parents were, and why he was different from other people and yet similar. More similar all the time, in fact. That is why he had wandered across the whole continent he now knew was called North America, passing through Canada to the United States, eventually coming to New York City. He had stopped first in the school in Fort Yukon, but his reception there was even more claustrophobic than at the hospital. Having just wandered in, he was peppered with questions about who he was, where his parents were, where he had been living. He didn't know at the time how to say he was hoping they could answer most of the questions they were asking him. He had learned much throughout his journey, including language. They built tools and dwellings that were much more advanced than any dam built by beavers, or nests built by eagles. He had found that he learned things very quickly. But he also learned the many ways that he was different from his fellow humans. One is that they often forget things they had seen, heard, or learned. For example, they would forget the name of a certain person they had met the night before, sometimes forgetting it on the spot, and yet could tell you what the name was not. He had no such truncated memories. He remembered everything he had seen or heard, and he could recall any memory if he truly concentrated. This was one of the very few abilities that had not faded since he had left the woods. His hearing had diminished since he had left Alaska, but not so much that he couldn't hear 2 robberies, 3 assaults, and 1 rape being committed within earshot as they closed the door on the barren cupboard. He called the store and paid delivery for the TV. Joel buzzed Tina into the outside door of his brick building. He had taken about 30 seconds to reach his phone, during which time Tina had rung the buzzer 5 times in mock exasperation. They were going to walk to the restaurant together, as today they both had a shift, Tina being a server there. Despite the security measures the locked outside door provided, The wrong folks sometimes got into the building. They snuck in as someone was heading out, or surreptitiously followed behind someone coming in, or sometimes a quick drug deal was done in the lobby, away from cops on the street. So when Joel heard someone ogling Tina, he wasn't surprised when he poked his head out a still chain-locked door and saw a non-resident, a wiry young man in a black parka, eyeing Tina as he passed her on the cracked marble steps. He let in 2 others, one with a green jacket and a big guy wearing blue. All 3 were looking Tina up and down, letting her know she had some tight shit, especially when it came to her sweet ass. The men surrounded Tina. She tried to push past them but was pushed back, tripping back into the first man, who now gave a lecherous smile, revealing a missing canine tooth. They were trying to grab at her now, including by her breasts and crotch, and were pulling her into a nearby apartment after one jimmied the door open. Despite her vociferous no's and her flailing attempts to block their groping, Joel could feel the blood rushing to his head. He turned around to go back into his apartment to call the police, until Tina's piercing scream told him that Tina might very well be dead, and almost certainly raped by the time they came, if not by the time he had completed the phone call. The sound of the men reminded him of a pack of wolves, pouncing on a wounded elk, but somehow worse. Shaking with a dormant animal rage, Joel ran down the stairs to the first floor, for the first time in his life actually thinking about the consequences if he failed. He threw open the door they had gone into and charged at the men. Luckily, he only knew how to hit one way, with the all-out force to stop someone from killing you. He never stopped running as he twisted his shoulders to put everything behind his right hand. He caught the man with the black jacket off guard, and he got it right on his jaw. The jaw went grossly to the right as he spun violently, stumbled, and fell. Joel was turning to his right when a punch to his head knocked him back, and he fell to the ground. The shock kept him from feeling the pain from the punch, but not from seeing the man in the blue jacket pouncing on top of him, pinning him. The other man, wearing the green jacket, kicked him viciously on the side of his head with steel-toed boots, right on his ear, which now began to bleed. The ringing and sharp pain it caused increased Joel's panic. The large man on top of him was kneeling on both his shoulders, his beer-stained breath hot on Joel's face. The man in black mumbled, "Motherfucker broke my fucking jaw." Joel could see even through clouded vision that his jaw was not just broken, but mangled and bleeding profusely, even as he feebly dodged punches and kicks, a thrashing that had broken his nose, one eye socket, and 3 teeth, and left him gurgling on his own blood. Joel understood now that these men weren't just teaching him a lesson or avenging his attack. They were killing him. This was clear before the man in black waved off the man in blue so he could stand. All his weight on one foot, on Joel's unprotected neck, cracking his Adam's apple. "Gonna kill this motherfucker, then go fuck that bitch up," he gargled. Joel could see Tina was on the ground and being pulled into the bedroom on the right by the man in green. It wasn't the thought of his impending death that saved his life, or the agonizing pain from having his face turned to mush. It was the mental picture of the thug's hands on Tina. Joel grabbed the stomping boot, and with a growl, threw the man in black up through the plaster ceiling. As he hung suspended, Joel shot up and snatched the gawking man in blue, throwing him face first through the cabinet door of the galley kitchen 10 feet away with a horrific crunch. Tina was kicking at the man in green as best she could, but he now had her pants unzipped. The man looked up in shock as Joel picked him up with his left hand by his neck, in a move that felt familiar and yet easier on thin, bare skin. Joel stuck the fingers of his right hand into the groove around the man's larynx and was about to pull out his trachea. "No," Tina cried, snapping Joel out of his almost autonomic kill. Instead, he threw the man, sending him out the plate glass window and 10 feet down onto the sidewalk, along Jerome Avenue. Joel ran over to Tina and asked if she was okay. Through sobs, Tina cried, "No!" He took Tina's arm and led her out of the apartment, and now heard coming sirens, the police and ambulances already on the way. Joel ran back into the living room, where he saw the man in black writhing on the hardwood floor in pain, and the man in blue knocked out cold, his head sticking into one of the cabinets, one knee resting on the counter, while the other hung off of it precariously. When police and medical teams arrived, the 3 assailants were carted off in a couple of ambulances, but Joel waved off treatment, already feeling himself healing. They gave statements, and Joel was not arrested yet. The police instructed Joel to stay in town for the next couple of weeks. The 3 older guys headed back to their cruisers, while a young black cop lingered for a moment. Glancing over at his more senior colleagues for a moment, he quietly said to them, "Hey, look, you didn't hear this from me." Odd, Joel thought. He was hearing from this man. "But I know these three guys. They're with the Knights." A terrified look from Tina let Joel know she knew who they were. "They're the worst gang around, man, and they don't leave jobs unfinished, if you know what I mean." "Damon, let's go," one of the older cops called out. "He means they aren't going to let us live, Joel. Word is going to get out that you beat them up, and they can't afford to let that lie." The young cop nodded. "I would get out of here if I were you." "But I would be arrested," Joel replied. "Maybe, but you can't plead your case if you're dead, which you'll probably both be tonight if you stay here." The cop started walking back even as he said this. Joel felt uncertain of his next step as he looked back at Tina. There was no ambivalence in her eyes. They were packing within the hour. 1 month later. It was a busy night at the Side Door Cafe in Chaplin, Connecticut. Joel had moved up to being a barback from dishwasher. There were about 30 Harleys parked outside, along with about 20 pickup trucks and 5 sedans. They were stuck with some campers, customers who weren't ordering anything more but wouldn't leave. He had already washed down the trays and refilled the woman's soda 4 times. It was well past last call, but the buzz the guy at the bar had was still going strong. His desire to get laid, as the colloquialism went, had given him the patience of a saint. The woman he had set his sights on prattled on about what an asshole her boss was. The man nodded sympathetically, and moreover said he was willing to help her drown her grief with the Busch Light beer he had back home. The beer he had drunk had not only given him the liquid courage to chat with this woman who seemed out of his league, it allowed him to believe he was still being witty when he said, "Ain't no problem Busch Light can't drown," for the 4th time. The pattern was starting to lull Joel into a daze, the loud sound of the woman's complaining, followed by the mumbled whispering of the man repeating his plea for her to come back with him. The cloying voice he was using was a detail he probably wouldn't tell his friends about if he was successful in getting her back. Their conversation was part of a pattern Joel had noticed amongst his fellow humans. Attractive women at a bar tended to complain to men, unattractive women to other women. The complaining was often about men, ones the women found attractive. Men they found unattractive weren't really discussed one way or the other. He had never, for example, seen a young woman at the bar see a sweaty, pot-bellied man with splayed teeth and a receding hairline and say, "God, he plays games." The restaurant had closed 15 minutes ago, and he realized there wasn't going to be a time that wasn't awkward to approach them. 10 minutes later, Joel had dropped off the would-be paramour alone. He'd been unable to convince Joel that the object of his affection should be dropped off at his place as well, for her own safety. And so, Joel headed home, in the $1,000 '86 El Camino he had just bought, hoping the suspension would survive hitting any rocks he might hit on the dirt road where his dilapidated one-bedroom rented house was located. Joel was having trouble getting to sleep. He never seemed to need much sleep anyway, thinking about Tina and the men who'd attacked her. He thought they were all okay, but he couldn't be sure. The police had told him the man who had flown into the cabinets was still in the hospital. They had all been arrested, and Joel would be traveling back to New York City for the first time in a month to testify at the trial. An hour later, he was traveling west through Hartford, now realizing why he had moved to Brooklyn, Connecticut, and why Tina and her mom had moved there with him. Brooklyn is in the rural northeast section of the state. Despite Connecticut's dense population, there were remote country areas. The northwest part of the state, Litchfield County, was a place of rolling wooded hills and stately colonial homes owned largely by wealthy New Yorkers as second houses. The biggest problem was often hiring a competent gardener. This was the other rural area. Here, the pickup truck in your driveway was your own. Your house was your only one, and both were owned out of necessity. It was a place for those priced out of the other areas of the expensive state. But that wasn't exactly what had brought Joel here. It was as close as he could be to New York City and still be in the middle of nowhere, 30 miles from the nearest major highway, 40 minutes away from the nearest city. Providence was actually closer than Hartford. It was close enough to New York City, however, to check up on a man you might have killed. The long ride gave Joel time to think about the last day Joel and Tina had in New York, a day they had spent at New York Botanical Gardens for the first time. It's funny how when a national tourist destination is in your backyard, you can always go, so you never do. The gardens are unusual in many ways. A bucolic setting surrounded by a dense city, an oasis of beautifully manicured lawns, open to all, in an increasingly gentrified town where owning a threadbare plot of land was increasingly out of reach. There were towering rose bushes, serene ponds, anodyne waterfalls, and for a fleeting moment, Tina's head on his shoulder. There had also been a most unusual set of plants there, long, spindly ones, called Spanish moss, that hung suspended, absorbing nutrients from the air. "That's a useful trait," Joel had noted. "As useful as vegetables get," Tina had responded with a playful shove. 2 hours past Hartford, he was back in the Bronx. Joel pulled into the parking lot of the hospital at 3:17 a.m. and asked to see the man who had been wearing the blue parka the night of Tina's attack. A man he had learned was named Horace Gordon. The beefy security guard at the desk looked at him like he was crazy. He asked him if he was aware that it was the middle of the night. Joel said he was, but he didn't really understand what the big deal was. His fellow humans were obsessed with sleeping at certain hours, instead of just sleeping when it was convenient. "Can you tell me what room he's in so I'll know for tomorrow?" Joel asked. The guard gave him another seemingly annoyed look. "No, we don't give out that information," the guard said. "Now go home and go to sleep. I wish I could." But the guard had inadvertently helped provide the information Joel needed. He had turned down the episode of Poker After Dark to scold Joel, giving him a moment to hear the breathing pattern of one Mr. Horace Gordon, one he recognized from their tussle a month earlier. Joel took his leave, then walked around behind the hospital. He looked at the brick wall next to a dumpster, concentrating on the grooves in it. He felt sure he had climbed trees in the past with less of a grip, but the memories were so vague he wondered if they were dreams. He felt like a 30-year-old recalling snippets of a 4-year-old he used to be, although he had lived in the woods until he was over 10 years old, he thought. He knew that a person wasn't supposed to be able to climb a brick wall. Nevertheless, he walked over to the wall and reached his hand up to it, feeling one of the white stripes between the red bricks. He thought of a gecko that climbed walls with feet that had grooves in them, so tiny that they could hook onto the invisible nooks and crannies of smooth glass. This wall was considerably coarser. A comfortable old feeling came over him as he tried to pull himself up. He dug his other hand into one of the grooves and started to lift his left foot onto another indentation. He couldn't believe how heavy his own body felt, like he was carrying 10 bears. Even still, he felt he might be able to make it. "What are you doing, guy?" he suddenly heard from below him. "Do you think you're Spider-Man or something?" a man said in a mocking voice. Joel sighed with relief when he saw that the man was an orderly on a cigarette break and not a guard. Joel's face started to get flushed as he tried to stammer out a response. "No, I was thinking about getting this kind of brick for my house, and..." "So you thought you'd fuck it to test it out?" the orderly chided, seeing Joel's upraised leg flat against the wall. Joel was saved from his nonsensical response by the sound of blaring sirens as an ambulance came in. "Gotta go," the orderly said. "Good luck with your home improvements." The task of climbing the wall quickly went from foolishly impossible to difficult, to commensurate with gliding on ice. Joel felt like he had lifted a bag of cement that broke at the bottom and got lighter as the cement spilled out. As with the fight to save Tina, he didn't so much gain strength as he remembered it. Reaching the 4th floor, he sidestepped over to the next window, pulled it open, and slipped inside. He pulled his head in first, then made it onto the floor. There were patients inside attached to various tubes, but the room was dark, and moving stealthily was something he was practiced at. He ducked out of the room and found Horace's. He stared at the man now, asleep in the hospital bed, using his infrared vision. Joel was remembering the pure lust in his eyes when he had looked at Tina, with no thought for anything but satisfying his own loins. Joel could easily kill him now without getting caught. Instead, Joel reached down and touched the gash that covered about half of the man's head. The gash started to seal up as if an invisible zipper was being pulled. That's when the light went on. Joel spun around to see a dark face filled with rage and a hand reaching for a gun. He heard, "Mother!" In one quick motion, Joel leapt to his left and crashed through the window as bullets whizzed by, his arms over his head as he spun end over end and fell 40 feet to the street below. He landed on a driveway between two buildings of the complex, tucking himself into a tight ball as he slammed into the asphalt. His rolling wouldn't have saved him from great harm or death if his outside layers of bone hadn't turned instinctively into cartilage. His body bounced off the driveway and crashed hellaciously into the brick wall of the adjacent brick building. The Knights gang member who had shot at Joel leaned out the broken window. In a rage, he looked down and across the well-lit expanse of the driveway. Seeing nothing, he pulled his body back into the room. Joel peeled himself off the brick wall, his body having taken on the flat aspect of a flounder combined with the transparency of the ice fish. After morphing back to human form, he jogged out of the alley. He had underestimated the patience of the Knight. The bullet that zipped by his ear now told him. Joel ran to his car, nearly being hit by an ambulance that was arriving. He drove off madly as 2 bullets blasted holes in the rear window. Joel finally realized that the man he had seen wasn't coming after him. He didn't realize, however, that a heroin addict who had been treated for seizures and not incidentally one of the Knight's customers had just been released and was walking out of the hospital just as Joel was peeling out. The addict had caught just enough of the altercation to think taking a photo of the license plate of the El Camino was worth it. When the burly shooter ran past the cowed security guard, only to slow and give the sallow addict a faint look of recognition, however, he was sure of it. "Yo, did you see that car bugging out of here, man?" His recent near-death experience and promise to his nurse to get clean notwithstanding, the addict responded. "What's some good info on the car worth to you? I think we can work something out." The glass and concrete structure that was the East Con Library was like a candy store to Joel. He sat at a table surrounded by books he had taken off the shelves. One was called The World's Most Unusual Animals. Another was called Hunter and Prey. He had also pulled out almost the entire Encyclopedia Britannica. His unerring memory helped him again. As a child, he had been able to take the shape of animals he was familiar with. When he regained the ability, it was now tied with knowledge he had gained about the animals, either through experience or reading. Reading was how he had been able to take on aspects of an ice fish, despite never having seen one. Joel drove home and parked his El Camino in the driveway of Tina's cabin. He got out and started to walk the quarter-mile into the woods to the smaller cabin he had recently built for himself. But then Tina popped her head out of the door and called out, "Hey, you're not just gonna walk on by, are you? My niece is here. She'd love to meet you." Joel came into the small 2-bedroom cabin to see this first visitor Tina and her mother had chanced. Martina, Tina's 6-year-old niece, sat playing on the floor, fastidiously moving her hands around an imaginary object with great concentration. After a brief introduction, the 6-year-old asked, "Do you like my crystal castle? I made it to keep the goblins out. I have the princess right at the very top." She motioned to the apex of the phantasmagorical edifice. "Do you like it?" "Of course he likes it," Tina said before Joel could answer, giving him a crooked smile. "I'm afraid I think your castle is poorly designed," Joel said. "First of all, I would have the princess at the bottom of the castle, near many different secret tunnels, that would allow for her escape rather than trapping her at the top." Joel heard a groan, but continued. "Moreover, I'm afraid making your castle out of crystals is a poor choice. You see, any substance with a crystalline framework is structured along planes. Strike them hard enough and they will cleave off along these planes, making for excess damage versus—" "Okay, Joel, we're running late for work," Tina said as she tugged at his arm. Joel took a quick look down at his watch. It was plastic and cheap, but it nevertheless told him they didn't have another shift for several hours. Joel now realized this was one of those questions his fellow humans often asked, children or no, where they were actually asking to hear what they wanted to hear and not an actual answer. Tina waved him outside and back on his way. Joel resumed his walk toward his own home. It was small but sturdy. He had built it by hand, wood logs combined with stone supports at the corners. He had set up an electric generator and gotten his oil tank up and running. He was still working on setting up his septic system, so he relieved himself in the same manner he had as a child. That generator had run out of fuel, so he turned down Tina's offer to get ice cream with her family, to work on that and some other maintenance. Joel was bent over the generator pouring gasoline in when a bullet whistled by his ear. Joel's heart raced as he became a 6-foot-wide fluke, flattening himself on the ground. He then grew a set of eyes on stalks that faced the street. Joel saw a 30-year-old Acura Legend and a black Lexus GS 300 had pulled onto their isolated street in broad daylight. There were 4 men in each car, all of whom looked vigilant. Joel sprouted legs again, those of a giant froghopper. The multi-jointed legs grew thick latches of protruding chitin that allowed them to act like compressed springs. He leapt the 50 yards up and forward in one bound. A human insect satyr dodging gunmen not quite dumbfounded enough to stop shooting. Joel was 30 feet above the thugs when he was hit by 5 bullets, all of which bounced off the 4-inch thick, grooved Ankylosaurus armor that now ensconced his underbelly. He changed his entire body to a stout 6-foot version of the dinosaur with long, leathery legs as he crashed onto the first car, spraying the thugs with safety glass. Joel simultaneously sprayed the windshield of the car behind him with thick, oily octopus ink from an orifice that had sprouted from his rear. 4 octopus tentacles grew out of the dinosaur body and gripped the upper frame of the car on which he sat through the 4 open windows. Immediately after, 4 more tentacles grew out of Joel and darted through the windows as barbs grew onto the ends of the appendages. Joel angrily stabbed each thug simultaneously with a neurotoxin. Joel roared as he felt what had to be armor-piercing rounds penetrate his skin and into the upper part of his Ankylosaurus rump. He whipped his reptilian head around to see all 4 men in the rear car leaning out to shoot him. Joss, the driver of the rear car, never thought this initiation would go down like this. He figured they made him drive because he would be the first guy shot at if shit went wrong. But this was something else entirely. Regardless, he leaned out his window, holding his smoking Glock after firing his expensive armor-piercing round. The pricey bullets were used only on special occasions, which this had just become. Joss figured the bullet had hit the 4-foot-wide ass 15 feet away, but he didn't think this thing would disintegrate. And yet, after a yelp from the monster, the thing disappeared. A lanky Latino with a gold front tooth, Joss looked around at his passengers to find the same bewildered look on their faces as he had on his own. Joss started the car, more than happy to leave the knights past in the front car to fend for themselves. He started to pull away, but an annoying fly was buzzing his face. He stopped to swat it away. He raised his hand only to have the fly's head instantly sprout into that of a rattlesnake. Sharp fangs bit into his right hand, sending searing, agonizing venom pulsing through Joss's veins. He found his suddenly paralyzed body, dragged out of the seat, and dumped onto the ground. All he could move was his eyes as the back of his head lay in the mud, his lungs struggling for shallow breaths. Joss found himself ignored for the time being as the creature became a foot-long octopus. He saw it only as it pulled its gelatinous body onto the rear driver's side door and flattened and camouflaged itself so completely as to be imperceptible. It even took on the texture of the door's uneven rust spots. Joss's understandably wary cohort, Tyrese, on the rear driver's side scoured his field of vision for the suddenly missing attacker. Tentatively, he reached down and touched the rust spot, seemingly relieved to find the raised stain dry and coarse. Joss feebly tried to croak out a warning to Tyrese as he opened his door. His first step outside resulted in an immediate and savage bite from the sharp beak of the octopus. Tyrese stumbled and fell, oblivion taking him a moment after his face evinced his shock. Will, the scruffy white gangbanger who had been sitting to Tyrese's right, stumbled out his door, even as he was transfixed by the attack unfolding on the other side of the car. He didn't notice that the creature was draped over his side of the car as well. As the creature had unveiled his octopus form to bite Tyrese, he had draped an extended tentacle over the car that then forked out into 100 willowy tendrils of a Portuguese man-o'-war. Will ran through the poisonous gauntlet, his eyes focused away from the threat until it was too late. He fell onto the street on the other side of the car. The creature now appeared wholly as a grizzly bear in the back seat. The front passenger, James, turned to shoot the bear, but it threw its now massive bulk into the back of the seat, crunching it forward and pinning the muscular man against the dashboard, his arm contorting upward as bullets went up through the roof. The bear reached his huge head around with a roar, then quickly bit James on the shoulder, sending paralyzing venom from the snake fangs in its ursine mouth. Joss saw that James was already slumping into the dashboard as the bear morphed back into human form and walked calmly around to him. He was still paralyzed from the neck down, barely able to breathe. Joss was now looking into the face of a slender, biracial young man who wore a navy blue golf shirt and khakis. The young man crouched over him and pulled his wallet out of his pants. He leafed through it briefly and then put it back. "Hello, Joss," the man said calmly. "I've injected you with a neurotoxin, but you probably guessed that by now. I also injected everyone but you and the other driver with a large dose of gabapentin that my body synthesized, an analgesic that will interfere with their short-term memory formation. I'm going to ask you some yes or no questions. You won't be able to speak for a while, so I'd like you to blink twice for yes and once for no. Do you understand?" Joss blinked twice. "I'm very upset that you came here and tried to kill me. Are you going to come here again?" Joss blinked once, strenuously. "I'm glad to hear that. But now I have to ask you another question. Are you a good advocate?" Joss darted his eyes back and forth, unsure of the right answer. "I don't mean to ask a trick question. You see, my fear is that regardless of your intentions, your friends are going to want to return here and finish me off. I need to know if you can convince them that is a bad idea." Joss double-blinked furiously. "I'm glad. Still, in all, I wonder if you could use a little help." As the young man said this, his right index finger began to elongate, then coil up on itself like the proboscis of a butterfly. The digit uncoiled its tip, turning a little saggy and translucent. A moment later, the fingertip became fetid, stringy ooze, embedded with small white eggs. The young man pried open Joss's mouth with his other hand. "Have you ever heard of parasitic wasps, Joss?" The terrified thug blinked once. "You never studied them in school?" One blink again. "That makes two of us. I'm sorry to hear you never heard about them, though. They're quite interesting." The floppy column of white slime entered Joss's open mouth, hanging precipitously over his esophagus. "You see, parasitic wasps take an interesting tack to the age-old problem of how to feed their young. They can't just drag a dead carcass into their nest. Their larvae eat live flesh. And you know babies, they're always hungry." As Joel said this, a couple of the ensconced eggs hatched, and frenzied worm-like larvae emerged, waving their slick, striated bodies back and forth as they struggled frantically to reach Joss's throat. So what parasitic wasps do is they paralyze their prey and then insert their eggs inside of them. When the eggs hatch, the larvae eat the victim from the inside out. It's very unpleasant. The proboscis stiffened as it was shoved even more deeply down Joss's throat. "That's why I'm asking, are you a good advocate?" Joss blinked twice in frequent, intense bursts. "I hope so. But I'm wondering if it would just be easier to plant these eggs inside of you. They would make a strong argument not to return all on their own. When the wasps came crawling out of your flesh, that is. Hopefully you would still be alive to explain how they got there. Do you think I need to plant them?" Joss blinked once. The young man pondered for an agonizing minute, and then said, "Okay." With that, he pulled the proboscis slowly out of Joss's throat. A drop of viscous fluid fell onto Joss's lips. The young man scooped a determined, wriggling larva a moment before it would have fallen to the back of Joss's throat. "Sorry about that," the young man said as the bug merged into his flesh. He got up and walked toward the other driver. Joel used his ever-improving skills to become a handyman, which paid better than being a busboy, while allowing him to remain largely anonymous. Joel was nearly tireless now, and he was stronger and could work many times faster than a normal man. On off hours, he would frequently change his hands to the claws of a groundhog, and would even turn himself into a giant earthworm in order to dig out an ever-expanding underground complex, where he could conduct experiments. His thirst for knowledge was insatiable, and he became a fixture at the East Con Library, where he would read countless websites, not only about animals and nature, but also genetics, biochemistry, nanotechnology, astrophysics, and countless other fields. He could absorb a whole page of material instantaneously and remember it forever. The only limit being the speed of his connection. When he could not understand something initially, which was very rare, his mind would literally adapt, rapidly sending out neural connections to make him smart enough to understand the material. The equipment at his house initially was just what could be purchased for a couple of $1,000s from catalogs, which wasn't much. That's why he began to sneak into the East Con physics and chemistry labs, and then the Yukon labs. He could make himself as small as necessary to get by any doors. He took apart the equipment there and put it back together to learn how to build similar or even improved devices. Sometimes a security guard would hear something and come in, but he never noticed the gnat on top of one of the Bunsen burners. It wasn't long before his experiments started bearing fruit. Joel's breakthrough was a pill that liquefied and broke down arterial plaques, causing them to be eliminated through the urine and feces. The drug would break down into little oblong capsules that had several layers. The sticky bottom layer was designed to wear away quickly after bonding to arterial plaque. There was then an acidic liquid layer with a time-released alkaline liquid above that soon rendered both layers inert for removal from the body. Joel knew the pill could save millions of lives and accomplish something he couldn't personally. Unlike his ability to heal injuries, which really just consisted of lending more energy and speed to the body's natural healing process, this pill accomplished something no person or even creature did naturally. But he didn't have the resources to distribute it. There was one company that did have those resources and scientists with intelligence enough to understand and manufacture his pill. Bob? Robert's dapper, urbane attorney, Ron, came into the no-tech CEO's expansive Manhattan penthouse office with a box about 2 feet square carried by Barry, a vigilant security guard. This was marked to be opened by you only. We ran all the usual security checks and it came in clean. What is it? Dr. Harrington asked. You mean no one screened what was in there just because he wrote I should open it personally? Do you know how many nutcases try to send me nonsense with that written on it? Yes, and that's why we did try to open it, Ron said. And? We can't. Why not? Because the box is made of reinforced steel with a Kevlar lock that we can't break through. So how are we supposed to open it? You are simply to ask it to open, Ron replied. Robert looked questioningly at his lawyer. That's what it says on the box. We think he may have built a voice recognition device into it. He could have heard you on one of your TV appearances. Well then, I wouldn't want to leave this box unopened after our mysterious benefactor went through so much work, Robert said. Please open box. It did. The seam that was almost imperceptible opened up on one side as the top opened on its hinges, which had also been imperceptible. Ron saw Robert take out what looked like diagrams and a sample of a milky liquid in a capped test tube. I'd like to honor our friend's wishes and take a look at this myself. I'll give you a call when I'm finished. Ron was at his desk, filling out a marketing compliance form from the FDA when his phone rang. It was Dr. Harrington. Arrange a meeting with whoever sent this package, he said. There was no return address. Find him and arrange a meeting. We really don't have much to go on as far as find him and arrange a meeting. Dr. Harrington hung up. Joel was working in his now massive laboratory 6 stories underground his humble cabin, working on a cure for paralysis. He had read about how severed hands could be reconnected and made functional again. He was now attempting to reconnect the spinal cord of a rat. He had learned how to physically reconnect the spinal cord and now had all the necessary chemicals, including synthesized neurotransmitters he would need. Joel placed the rat on the lab table. He bathed the severed spinal cord with the neurotransmitters before reconnecting it. The rat was still paralyzed. He could adjust the lenses of his eyes to see the still deadened link, as if he was looking under a microscope. Moreover, he could see that the nerves had closed up, not allowing a signal through the neural pathway. There was a chemical he didn't recognize, along with an entire bramble of tissue blocking the signaling, including the potassium channels located beneath the myelin layer. Regardless of the chemicals and tissues involved, the body was working against its own cure. He was rubbing his eyes and shaking his head in frustration, just as he heard a faint cry from a young boy out in the woods.